So it is September 30th, 2019, and we're here with Ann Smith, who is the founder, a longtime coordinator of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program's Veterans History Project. And thank you for being here this
It is my
afternoon.
pleasure.
My name is Paul Ortiz. I'm director of the Oral History Program. And Ann, I wonder if we could start by having you tell me a little bit about kind of where you grew up, what life was like as a young girl.
Well, I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, but most of my family and relatives were from the Chicago area. So we lived there sometime when I was a small child. I moved to Tennessee for a period of time, Chattanooga, and then also when my father was transferred with his job, we went back to Illinois, but lived in a small town, Galesburg, which is maybe about the size of Gainesville some time ago, but it had a small liberal arts college, Knox College. And when I graduated from high school in that community, I knew I wanted to be a nurse, had always wanted to be a nurse. I don't know why, because no one in my family, in that day and age, nursing and teaching were the choices for most women if they intended to go into a career. But I always, took care of the pets and took care of the neighborhood children. And wonderful reading was my mother's Red Cross first aid book. I knew how to wrap an ace bandage around your elbow like nothing. So we were looking for a college and a program for me. And that was just in the era when nursing education was saying this needs to be an equivalent degree with the people that you're going to be working with. And so a hospital training program is not all you need. And so we looked for a university program, and most of the Eastern schools were terribly expensive. I considered schools around. It would have been nice if I could stay close to home, because I hadn't been away from home and I was close to my family. And it turns out that the program at the University of Iowa was absolutely stellar and accepted me, and their baccalaureate program has stayed kind of in the top baccalaureate and graduate programs for years and years.
And were there people who, now you mentioned you were no one said, hey, you should be a nurse, but there's a range of possibilities for young women in terms of the professions. Mm-hmm. Were there other women, like elders, older women, who you kind of looked up to as a role model?
I had an aunt that never married, but she was in a career. She worked in a law office in Chicago. And I always saw her as living independently and making her own money. And so I saw her kind of as a role model from that standpoint. I don't think of anybody who, as far as being a caretaker or that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I tell the story that when I was, I guess 3 or 4, my father had just a roaring head cold. And being the caretaker I was, Mother said, take this aspirin and a glass of orange juice upstairs to your father. This is his medicine for right now. But she wrapped me up in some kind of sheet thing and something on my head that looked more like a nun than anything else. Red crayon made a red cross here. I don't know who that was, but I went up and took the orange juice and aspirin, which just was wonderful as far as my father was concerned. However, patient behavior was not quite ethical, because he grabbed me when he finished the orange juice and threw me into the bed with him. And I thought, got to watch out for them. Got to watch out for them.
Were there pressures on young women where you grew up to not go into the professions, to just like,
I had probably all of my close friends from high school would go to a college around there, graduate with liberal arts, but they were destined to be MRS degrees. I mean, that was their objective, and all of them, are married now and have families and are happily retired with even, a part-time teaching job, playing with grandchildren.
but that phrase MRS degree means
Mrs.
right?
You go to find a man.
Even though you have a degree, but the
Many people, I think, told their daughters that's a fallback position. If something happens to your marriage, if something happens to the man who supports you, what do you do to make a living? Mm-hmm. And so...
Yeah, so you matriculate to this really good baccalaureate program, but I also wanted to get a sense historically from what you were saying earlier, and that this is kind of a new generation of professional training for nurses, because prior to this, you just got a certain level, right? So what was new about this?
Well, in the hospital programs, and many of them were quite good. I'm not trying to bash diploma nurses. Mm-hmm. What was primarily the concern was that you have a new class of students coming in and you don't have enough nurses. And so you got some training, much of it taught by physicians, which is not nursing. That's medicine. But you would then be told that it's your clinical time, and then they would go into the hospitals many times with very little or no supervision. And so you would have a student or two on the night shift that were relative amateurs and not necessarily doing very much. Well, that was what we were trying to kind of get away, because some hospitals really did count on their students to staff the hospital, and that was not the very best patient care. In the collegiate program, while we had to be on the clinical floors at least 20 hours a week, we also carried a full load of courses. The other thing that was basic was that we were going to be going to a university, and we were going to have a liberal arts education too. So the first 2 years was heavily weighted on campus. We would have, a course, Introduction of Nursing, or policies and laws and that kind of thing. But the rest was Western civilization and communication skills and historical things that were liberal arts. And the idea was that you are a fully rounded collegiate graduate when you leave Iowa. By the junior year, and we went 5 years, what they did is kind of crush 3 years of diploma school into 5 years. I graduated in August and only had the first summer off. And so we were constantly going to class, constantly in the clinical area. And we worked all the shifts, which I think were valuable. I mean, different things happen on evenings and nights. It's not just the day shift. And I loved it. I loved every minute of it. I would get nervous going to the next rotation. If you were just finishing pediatrics, you were nervous about going to the medical ward. And then you fell in love with that. And I thought, I don't know what to ask for. It's just about all of it was, you just loved it.
Were there particular instructors or mentors that come to mind that inspired you?
Well, I remember one who was a medical nurse, and she comforted me when I made a terrible grade. And I went in ready to just throw myself on the floor or on the desk and say, I give up. What did I do wrong? Shall I just get out of their way? And she said, no, that's not it. My difficulty was I think I'm not a good reader. I'm not a fast reader, and apparently my mind was someplace else when I was reading that paragraph. But on the clinical area, I was just making out like crazy and using all of the things that were the right technique and teaching younger students, that I didn't have to, but sharing what I did know. And well, I found that it works easier this way, it's still sterile kind of thing. So I loved it, just loved it. Another mentor I met several years later when I'd been out in practice. I'd been out in practice probably 6 years, and I'd been twice, I guess, promoted to head nurse positions in different places. And my supervisor sat me down for a regular evaluation, and she looked at me and she said, "If I were your age and I were going to continue in this field like you obviously are, I would go back to graduate school and get a master's degree." And I said, "I should. Never thought about it." And she's the one that sent me back to graduate school, and I went here for my graduate work.
What was graduate work like at UF?
It's so very different than undergraduate work. As an undergraduate, you had these chapters to cover, and you would have this clinical experience to match it, and you would have that test to write in, because we had separate grades. You had the clinical grade and you had the written grade. Sometimes they didn't jive at all, partly because I wasn't a good student with my book. But then in graduate school, they really wanted to know what was in your head. If you've read things on the bibliography, does that relate to anything you've seen? Do you see how you would practice differently? And the program at the university here did not have you specialize. We tried not to characterize nursing the way medicine is characterized. And so it was really hard to say, are you going to be a pediatric nurse? Go into the graduate program for pediatrics. And we tried to kind of generalize that, because other programs had a master's in cardiovascular nursing. Another program that I nearly went into was neurosurgical. And I thought, I don't know whether I want to specialize that much. I know I want to take care of adult patients, but I don't want to, just make it one system. And down here, the degree was in medical surgical adult nursing. And I thought, now that feels right. Now, we had to specialize doing papers and things, and I did a lot of cardiovascular work, and I did a lot of, I did a long paper on renal medicine and those kinds of things. But the classes were you're never finished. You go to the library and your bibliography is finished and there's still more to read. There's more to go to. And I never felt finished. But maybe that's what, a lifetime of learning is all about.
So, Anne, when you mentioned it, you loved all elements of nursing and the different, each of the different rotations. But in grad school, did you begin to think about, okay, this is an area that I really would like to work in?
I had favorites, I think, but I don't think I would have gone to an employer and said, I want to do this. In fact, right after graduation, the dean called me in and she said, what are your plans after graduation? And I said, I don't know. Something will happen. Everybody needs nurses. I have white shoes ready to go. Right. And she said, well, I'd like you to help us for a while. And she put me on the faculty. And she was a very strong and very accomplished dean, very respected nationally.
What was her name?
Dorothy Smith.
Dorothy Smith.
No relation. She was from Boston. She was kind of a large woman, and she stood in a doorway. And when she stood up from the behind her desk, you just quivered. I mean, her word was law. But she said, I said, no, 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 no. I said, I didn't take the education track to be on the faculty. I said, I took the clinical track. I took all of those courses. She said, well, she said, the reason I'm trying to offer you this job to teach med-surg nursing is because I've seen you in the clinical area and you obviously love it. And she said, I'm afraid that when students see instructors who are not good at what they do, don't like direct patient care, and have escaped to education, the students pick right up on it. She said, I want the students to see somebody who knows what to do but is happy about it. Oh, okay. Well, I did. I taught for 5 years and enjoyed the students. They were wonderful. Enjoyed the patients. They put me in a position that's called a teacher practitioner role. And for a long time, Shands and the College of Nursing had these dual roles where you were responsible for patient care, and that's what I did on the orthopedic unit. For 24 hours a day, you'd be responsible of the staffing, the procedures, going on rounds with the doctors and the residents and everybody. But at the same time, you'd be teaching the students over in the med science building and doing classes. It's really hard to get balanced traction down a hallway and into the room where you're teaching. It just doesn't work. But it was wonderful. I loved it.
And what years did you teach?
From 1967 to around 2000, I think.
What was happening in the field of nursing during those years that you were teaching? And you mentioned that you were part of that cohort who was getting a baccalaureate. Obviously, nursing is undergoing changes. But as you transition into being a college instructor of nursing or a university instructor of nursing, like what's changing in the field?
Well, one of the things was we wanted to get on more of an equal footing with medicine. I mean, we were going around on rounds, but there was still a strong environment of handmaiden. Please go get me coffee. Carry these charts for me, that kind of stuff. We were trying to get away from that, but at the same time, we're making rounds with the physician. And fortunately, I had a world-class orthopedic surgeon who was in charge of orthopedics, and he would bring all of his students, the residents and the interns. I would bring all of my students, but we would also go make rounds with physical therapy and all of their students. So when we went into a patient room, not only was it a crowd scene, but we had answers for everybody. And Dr. Enneking would turn around and say, well, such and such is the case. And what do you think about that? And admittedly, then we get out in the hall and he says, you know why I put you on the spot? Because I want your students to know what you know. Or somebody else would ask one of their students, what do you think is going on here? Or why can't we get this underway? But it was a learning environment the whole time, done very professionally. And we had some really sick patients, motorcycle accidents. And I remember a 16-year-old boy that had osteosarcoma of his leg bone, which was going to require at least an amputation. And no 16-year-old wants to know that, nor do their parents. And we had some really difficult cases. We had one man who was a foreign student, and he was from India, and he had to have so much of a spinal tumor removed that we weren't sure whether he was going to ever walk again. And we had to take care of him on a striker frame, which is kind of like a sandwich. And if he's on this flat surface and it's incredibly hard and can't move, and there's a place for a bedpan underneath, and he had a catheter, of course. But when we turn him, we'd put this top part of the sandwich on, turn down all of the screws, and then we would flip him over, which was not traumatic for him and not painful, but had to do that at least every 2 hours to make sure that he didn't get pressure sores, from laying in one position or on a bony prominence that smashed the capillaries in your skin between a hard surface and their body, a bony prominence usually.
In some ways, Anne, thinking, at a later date, I'd like to ask you more about your work in teaching nursing and, more about the field in general. Mm-hmm. But as I listen to you tell this really powerful story, I can't help but think about your work in really founding and mentoring and running the Proctor Program's Veterans History Project for so long. In some ways, do you see your career in nursing as a preparation in some ways for how you start?
Well, and it certainly was when we started doing the senior medical students, when we were trying to explain to them how to do an oral history. Mm-hmm. And I had this strong bias that there was going to be a veteran who was older than the person who was interviewing them, and was not going to have perhaps the experience to understand that you might have to wait for an answer. If you asked, what was somebody's experience, that they might be thinking about it or reliving it before they answered, and not to jump to their next question. I had to try to explain to people that I really thought active listening was important, and that meant eye contact, not checking your notes. That meant if someone was hard of hearing, they could hear you better, and they could also read your lips if you were across from them. Mm-hmm. I think those are all probably things that I dragged from nursing. But probably, I think I went over some of those things with everybody that we had that was interviewing. And we had wonderful interviewers like Don Obrist and Ray, who have picked up the ball. And then the transcriptionists were so difficult to recruit that I was doing a sales job with them, and in many ways nurturing each one of them. Even ones that were pretty good typists and could transcribe, something like Descript comes along and you think, forget the whole thing. And I tried not to lose them, but at the same time, they're volunteers too. Mm-hmm. And so I would not say, and where is Mr. So-and-so? That's missing. But say, I know you're leaving town to go see your grandkids. Take as long as you want. And that's what the transcription is in the veterans program. We're not on a deadline. It would be nice to get those back, as soon as we could. But, most of the transcriptionists are doing it for the love of listening to these wonderful stories. Ellen continues to stop where she is. She's just heard a little excerpt, and so she wants to look it up, and she Googles everything she can, the location of the battle, what else was going on that wasn't in the interview. Marie is the same way. Keith says, just give me these, I love these. Mm-hmm.
How did you first become involved in the oral history program and with Sam Proctor? When did you first kind of meet Sam?
Well, when I retired from healthcare, I knew I wanted something stimulating to do, and it wasn't going to be filing invoices, and it wasn't going to be folding envelopes, and it wasn't going to be pushing wheelchairs that had no brain power with it. And so for about 6 months, I just kind of slept late. And then I read the paper, and there was an article about the Seminole Indians. And I read the article in the Gainesville Sun because I was interested in the content. And so I read all the way to the bottom, and they're telling about these wonderful interviews with the elders of the Seminole Indians. And at the very bottom it said, we could always use volunteers. So I made an appointment, trucked over to the university, and talked to the secretary, and they said, well, we're just in the process of moving, one of many, I might add, and come back on such and such a date, and we'll tell you about the transcription. At that time, we transcribed in the office. You know, I didn't do anything at home and like my transcribers do. And so I came back, and they said, well, we'd like these to be turned around. And so they started me on the Seminole collection. Well, it was fascinating. I know how to make a chickee. I know how to make a dugout canoe. One of the interviews just delighted me because most of them were done outside. And you'd hear an airboat going by. Stop the thing. Okay. Then another one, you'd have to wait until the fellow who was doing the dugout canoe in front of the museum would finish scraping because you couldn't hear his answer because he was scraping out the dugout canoe. And then another one where they were talking about how did the Seminole Indians become involved in being cattlemen. And so they had an expert that was in charge of this cattle. And you heard cattle in the distance. But during the interview, and I see this poor graduate student trying to chase with her microphone and answer the question, and she asked him something, and he started to answer it, and he just, like he turned around over his shoulder and said, watch out where you step. And I mean, that's was on, and I just loving this, talk about the real world. But I got so enthused in that. And then somebody would come by our office and say, well, when Julian Pleasance became the director, he'd say, Ann, we've got this one that we need some hurry up on that. Would you start on that? And that was, I think, the water management district. And so I said, okay, sure. And so I switched to that. And then I did some others, you know, one at a time or the last few pages or whatever was needed. By that time, we had moved from Yon Hall. Do you know where Yon Hall is? And then we had moved to the 4th floor of Turlington. And even then, Sam Proctor was still coming in, and he'd just boop in 3 or 4 days a week and go from one to another and say, what are you working on? And sit down by my desk and say, well, what did they say? And then he'd tell his own stories, and he knew where all the bodies were buried and didn't mind sharing that. So it was wonderful to get to know him. He and Bessie, his wife, and we'd go out to lunch from time to time, just to have added time.
He was quite the storyteller.
Oh, yes, really, and loved it. He talked about how the program just began. The oral history program began here. He said he used to choose someone on the campus that was either a chairman or a faculty member and say, let's go out to lunch. And so they would do that. But all the time he'd say, I know that history is not going to be made by the minutes that I find in the files. I want to know, how come that part of the department closed down? I want to know why that professor isn't here anymore. I want to know. And he wanted to know all the backstory about what was going on or why it was going on. And he knew it. When Butler Plaza was first being built, he took Mr. Butler on one of those, and they were in the car, and he had hours of their conversation about what was going to go there and how much that land cost and what was going to go down there. And he had it right from the horse's mouth.
When did you first get the idea, or when did you start doing oral history interviews with military veterans?
Well, I started transcribing them first and enjoying that. And
So people in the program were already interviewing veterans?
we had some, yes. But they were scattered, and I don't even know whether they were in one collection or several. And I don't remember why I started doing the first interviews. I think it was somebody I knew. It might have been Bob Gachet or somebody like that. And of course, he was kind of a Gainesville hero. He was a Marine in Iwo Jima. That's one of the places.
All right. So so we were talking about, let's see. Oh, you were talking about Mr. Gachet.
Bob Gachet.
Bob Gachet. Okay. And so you, now I can't remember now, did you transcribe an interview with him, or did you?
No, I had met him, I think, somewhere, and now I can't recall where. And knew that he always had some kind of insignia on or had his hat on. He was a Marine all his life. And I asked him about it, and I said, would you mind if I interviewed you? So at that time I was also, volunteering at the Matheson Center. And I was looking for a quiet place to do the interview. And we did it in the Matheson House, which is the second oldest or the first oldest house in the county. And in their little kitchen, there were these little wooden chairs, and they were very hard at the end of 2 hours. But we sat there with the recorder, and it was totally quiet. And we talked, and he told stories that I will never forget. He's the one that told me that he had trained in Hawaii. They'd get on their landing craft, they would go out and then come back, and then they would put the flap down, as these do, and then storm the beach. But the sand in Hawaii is hard surface, like our beaches mostly are. And they went to Iwo Jima. Of course, they didn't tell them where they were going. They just said they got out into what he calls the volcanic ash from Mount Suribachi. And he said it was like quicksand, that he sank in as far as his knee. But at the same time, they were under heavy fire from the mountains, from the Japanese who had dug in, not a foxhole, not a big area for artillery. They had hospitals, they had dining areas, they had sleeping areas. And he said, that's when we said, we're on Iwo Jima. The Japanese are in Iwo Jima. And they had all of these things just trained on the beach. And he said, so not only couldn't we stand up and run, we couldn't dig a foxhole for any protection because it folded in just like quicksand. And he described it so that I could see, from his viewpoint, that Mount Suribachi was over there. And many people would ask him if, in fact, he was part of the group that raised the flag, the famous picture of the 4 Marines, or 5, holding up the flag. And he said, no, that was the other unit that we traveled with. But he said, I saw it go up. And so they were just landing. That 2 hours, was just gripping, but we weren't finished. And so I said, well, I think we ought to make another appointment. Okay, we made another appointment. He talked for another 2 hours. with my eyes getting bigger all the time. We weren't finished. I said, we better make another appointment. He has A, B, and C in that collection. And then he said, well, you ought to join our group, which I did, which is the Iwo Trio. He happened upon, many years ago, 2 other fellows that were at the same time about, not in his unit, but in Iwo Jima for all that bloody war. And so they got together and started comparing notes. And the person who owned the restaurant came over to them and said, my dad was in World War II. And he wanted them to know that that corner would be reserved for them every month for them to come in. Pretty soon they knew other people that either were Marines or would be interested in what they were saying. By the time I met him, he was meeting at Jerry's Delicatessen. We had Navy people. Even Navy people could come. But he had people from all of various encounters. And he was such a loyal Marine, such a loyal military person, that every time we went for our lunch, we would salute the flag, we would sing, we would see, I think there were 4 or 5 videos for each of the services, and he would ask that serviceman to stand and salute his service. It was just incredible. And there were people that didn't like to go to that because they said, that early part, that all of, every time, and you'd say, oh, you don't have to, but that's what he did, and he took care of the program, and then he would have a speaker, but they, the room was jammed, we'd buy our lunch and go in to Jerry's back room, the back room. But then I started meeting others. Said, have you been interviewed? And then the general would come in. I can't remember his last name, but everybody deferred to him, But they brought their spouses many times. One man who was in the Navy sat across from me several times, and that was his day to babysit. And he had a little girl who must have been, 5 maybe. And she might have some ice cream, but maybe not. He was real shy.
So, Anne, you started by transcribing interviews, and now you're going on to do interviews with people like Mr. Goucher, and then spending time with the Iwo Trio. Were you beginning to do this, or think about this as like a kind of a focused project rather than just kind of ad hoc interviews?
Well, yeah, I think that it dawned on me that it was more than, one interview or one transcription. I don't like cold weather, which is why I stayed in Florida, part of the reason. But when I would hurry across campus in time to write the next part of the transcription, I wanted to know what happened next. I knew that I was captured, but it's not unlike working evenings in my day, where you would go in and the evenings were less hectic than days. Families might come in, so you would see, a more balanced picture of the individual you were taking care of. But just fascinating stories, and I have not met a dull person or a person that I wasn't interested in knowing more about. I mean, if you are patient or ask the right questions, everybody has a story, or 2 or 3. And so I think at that time, we knew we didn't have enough people to transcribe. And one of the things I remember doing is organizing. We put a notice out about offering, interest in, if you have an interest in oral history, and if you would like to learn how to do interviews or transcription. And we gave the program down at the Matheson Center and said, here's where you sign up. Well, people swamped the table afterwards wanting to answer a question, and several people dropped out, and one person who came up to me was Marie. And Marie came up to me and she said, we just moved down here 2 years ago. And she had been working in Colorado, I think in their libraries. Mm. And she said, I'm looking for something. And she said something like, that will serve a purpose and have an impact. I said, we've come to the right place. And I explained to them what our picture of oral history was about, that I would have been a history major if it had had anything to do with oral histories. But I had chapter 12 that was just dull as could be, and I probably was doing algebra over here thinking I was reading, because if I passed the test, I guess I did, because I graduated high school, but I couldn't connect at all. And yet all I had to do but all I had to do is hear one oral history or one person's story. And my family and friends are so up to here with my stories, they can't stand it. I mean, they stop and say, you told me that before. But they don't say, hi, Ann, how have you been? They say, who have you interviewed now? Right. I mean, it's catching. It really is.
What are some of your other, some of the stories that really stick out to you that you've done in the Veterans History?
Well, I'm doing a series of little short versions. I'm in a couple of writing classes because I don't think I write very well. And so some of these, your friends give you gentle criticism. And I've done, I think, 12 of our veterans that were standouts. And I don't go back and read the interview. I just do, why do I always tell that story? But I've got favorites, that for some reason just stood out. And then I've got some others that are just incidents. I can't remember his name, but I remember that his wife was so delighted to have me out in their trailer talking to him over the kitchen table. And I was just stricken because here was my recorder, and she wanted me to be so happy with the interview that she was going to give me fresh eggs from their chickens. She put them in a plastic crackly bag and said, here, eggs, crackle, 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 crackle. That wasn't bad enough. She went out in the kitchen, and I heard her open the refrigerator, and her clack, 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 was getting me some ice for some ice water, and brought it to the table, and clack, 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 clack. Thank you very much. But the things you can't control. Yeah. I don't remember his name. I don't remember his face even. But the stories that I remember, like I'm doing one, I've just recently finished one on Anthony Duke, as in Duke University. And the other side of the family was responsible for starting Drexel University. His mother was a high society person in Philadelphia. His father's family had started American tobacco industry in 1890-something. And he, as a little boy, had lost his father when he was 5. And the family was very close, very wealthy, lived in mansions, had servants, they went to prestigious schools. And he saw his uncle, who was in the military, as his hero. And when the family would get together, his uncle would say, come on. And they would go to the next room, and he would teach him things about about the military and about how to defend himself. And Tony was a small man, and he said, I can teach you 10 ways to kill another person with your bare hands. And he was telling me this story in great detail, and I said, are we doing all right on the interview? Is there any other questions you'd like me to ask? And we were teasing and stuff. But he, at age 17, had occasion to go to a youth camp where they had the poorest of the kids in the New York area, gave them a little experience to see green trees and do some activities. And he had occasion to take 2 of them back down to the tenements and take them home. And he said that he had an unsettling experience as he was going down the steps of this rickety tenement after seeing where they lived, a single mom maybe, lots of children, 2 rooms, sharing a bath down the hall. And he realized what luxury he was going back to, and feeling really, his word was unsettled about the whole thing. And he, I think, went back the next year because he recruited all of his classmates. He says, let's be counselors, what fun. And did some more things. And then it was time, he said he had had several trips over to Europe. And he said, I knew from what I had seen in Europe that war was on the way. He joined the Navy, and the first 2 years he operated as an intelligence officer in Argentina, and he was to kind of ferret out who was pro-American and who was pro-Nazi. Then they assigned him to I guess the largest landing craft that they had. And he was on the West Coast, about to leave. He had 13 officers, and he had 136 men, I think. But 12 of them were from African American. He said he had a cross-section of the American population. He had people of every generic background, and he said, but he kept hearing a lot of slander and language against the black. And he said there were only 12 of them. And so before they left port, he said he couldn't be captain of that ship and get anything done. He said, I would not have been able to get my mission accomplished if there was all this strife. He got on the microphone and said, anybody who uses the N-word, and he used it, he says, if I hear anybody say that word once, they will be locked up in the brig for an hour. If I hear it a second time, you will be locked up for 24 hours. And if I hear more than that, I am locking you up until the end of the war. Keep in mind that if this ship goes down in battle, you will go down with it. And this is his daughter had called me to do this interview and asked me to please kind of make sure it was soon because he was dying of throat cancer. So I went over to her condo and we went in, and he was sitting in kind of a darkened living room, and he really was kind of a small man, and he had kind of a raspy throat. And he was telling me all these stories. And I said, Tony, how, at your young age, now he was in his early 20s now, but how did you know to do that? How did you know you could? And he just said, just instinct. But he did things like that throughout his life. After he came back from the Navy, he went to find, this boys group that were from Harlem and from the inner city. and they had kind of dissolved. And he made up his mind that would not happen. He went around to all of his friends. He obtained money. He moved it out to Long Island. He called it the Harbor Boys. Later, they added girls to the program where they would go out. They had resident programs. He would take them fishing. He taught them how to say their prayers at night. He taught them how to get along in society. He taught them their schoolwork and how they had to finish or they would not be successful. And as well as taking them to the beach and letting them drive his dune buggy. And he apparently built his mansion home on Long Island on adjacent land to this place. And he said, I told any of them if they wanted to come and see me and talk about anything they wanted to come and see me. And he said, I don't think any of my 4 wives liked that. Maybe not. But he was an extraordinary person, and I have his book. That's his own autobiography that was written before. But you see pictures of him with his whole family, doing activities with these boys.
What does the oral histories what do oral histories capture that books don't?
Oh, I wish I could answer that, because it would be the answer to your previous questions, because why I couldn't read my... I can't remember from my high school history book what date the battle was or what the general's name was. But I can tell you all about Tony. And Tom, and Bob Guichet, and all the other 12. One of the reasons I started doing this was one of my volunteers said, why don't people know about these? Why don't they know about the oral histories? And, how do they, you say you can read anything you want to, and here's the link. That isn't enough. And so that's why he said, why don't you, I have coffee with him kind of a regular basis, and he was so sick of my stories, he said, write them down. I said, what do you mean? They're transcribed. No. He said, write a short story, just a brief thing about them. And now I'm kind of contemplating a suggestion Deborah made about just a 1-page reworking and make it sound like an interview, but maybe kind of a creative writing thing where I ask Tony this and he answers that. That's not a direct quote, but pretty close.
Kind of like how what people have been taking the oral histories we've done over the years and putting them on stage.
Yeah.
Their performances.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. But there's a way in which the drama of the stage, or maybe even of the printed word, can bring out some of these stories.
And I think a lot of the interviews, if you're in a hurry or if you haven't really listened, they're average and not very interesting. And I think part of that is the responsibility of the interviewer, don't you? Mm-hmm. If you haven't asked a follow-up question about, well, what did you mean by that? And so many of the World War II veterans, they want to tell their story. And Tom is a good example of, we gave his wife and family a CD of the video. And a number of months after we finished all of that, his sons had gotten so enamored with his father's story, but one of his sons said, I'm going to try to write to the government and get your medals back. All of Tom's insignia and everything had either been stolen or had been lost in transit. And he got that back, at the same time that all the family was going to get together. A daughter from California, I think, and another son were going to get together, and they were going to go to the armory because they were going to have this big ceremony and have somebody of prominence give him his medals. And then they were also going to have, a cookout with all of his friends and family, and so they had a buffet. Oh, Tom wanted me to meet his son, meet his wife, and Millie came up to me and she said, I have known that Tom has held something back, has had something, and she called it, has held something on his heart for all these years. And I have told him, he said, if you won't tell me, give it up to the Lord, because they're very religious people, and she wanted to help him. And he said, no. And so many of the veterans don't want to tell their loved ones because it upsets them, or the wives cry, well, we can't have that. So she came up to me and she said, when I saw that video of Tom, I knew what it was that he had told Deborah and I that he had never told anyone else. I don't know what it was. She's the only one who knows Tom well enough to know that his face changed or that he'd never heard that information. But it's that kind of thing that just makes your day.
Well, I remember, Ann, after our Deborah Dinah had produced the documentary on the survivors of the Bataan Death March. And you remember we made that was one of our first public programs here, shortly after I arrived, was to show this film about the survivors and what they'd experienced during World War II in this horrific death march, and then being prisoners of war for years.
Yeah.
But and then the survivors, their families came from all over the country to see this documentary, and so many of them told us the same thing. They said, my husband or my father or my brother never told me this story, but he told it to you, and so now you're the guardian of this amazing story.
Remember one of the people that we wanted to have on the panel, but he was really too ill, but he was signed out of the hospital against medical advice, and he was sitting in the front row.
His daughter spirited him out of the hospital. He was not supposed to go.
He was not ready for discharge.
And you see photographs of him, and he has his IV and the apparatus, the wristband, and so I guess we colluded in a crime of some kind.
Gladly. Gladly. But the audience, do you remember? Everybody, men, women, crying, because it was such a powerful story.
It wasn't, and it was unexpected stories too, because people, like when you mentioned Iwo Jima, I mean, I grew up around a lot of World War II veterans in a Navy town, but or you mentioned the Bataan Death March, and people think they know what that means.
From their history book.
From their history book, which is a pale imitation.
Clean it up. Don't let the students be upset.
Exactly. And I think that's the power of, because a lot of those Bataan Death March stories make people very upset.
Yeah.
Using the N-word makes people very upset. And so we try to sanitize it, but the reality is people use it.
That's right.
To inflict harm. And so to me, that's one of the important things that we do.
It sure is.
Do in oral history. Well, Ann, I've taken up a lot of your time. We've been talking more than an hour.
Oh, I'm just getting warmed up.
All right. And we are coming kind of towards the end of our class session, which I think we end at 1. Is that right, Abby? I think.
1:45.
Okay, so we have a little more time, but it ends at what?
A double block.
Okay, very good. So we could be here for all day.
I won't do that to you.
No, but well, at this point, are there questions that any of the students or folks have for Ann that you might?
I was wondering what it was like for you. So I have nurses in my family. My sister's a nurse, and so did you see women getting more and more access in the medical field during your time as a nurse? And were you seeing women kind of move up the ranks?
I think it turned into a collegial relationship with the physicians they worked with much more. And I think it's partly up to the nurses to act intelligent. There's a good example of that when a patient needs something, a change in their medication, or is not doing well. It's our responsibility to notify the physician. But you can say, he's not feeling well, and not have the chart in front of you. And the doctor will say, what's his blood pressure? Just a minute, I'll get it. You should have all that right in front of you. And if you're smart and it's 3 a.m. in the morning, you better know what you're talking about. You better have something to back up, why you're calling. But physicians, they learn just like we do that you're not just doing a clinical thing, you're also teaching. And so if you make rounds with a doctor, lucky you can ask some questions of him. You can ask some questions on behalf of the patient. There was a physician that was the chief of staff that I worked with for a while, and he would tell his patients that he was sending home, he says, now don't you worry about the medications at all. I'm going to write them all up there and leave them with the nurse. But he didn't say, I've got 4 prescriptions and one's for your heart and one's for your lungs and one's for That is not helpful. But I think that in answer to your question, there are more colleagues now than they ever have been, because too many times the nurses on the night shift have saved their skin or have been able to do something to alleviate things, by the time they come in. But I think it's getting there. Every once in a while, you'll read a physician who thinks they walk on water and they don't.
But less of handmaidens, as you described.
Well, when I first went to North Florida, I was an assistant director of nursing. And the director was kind of from the old school. And she said, now when Dr. X gets off the elevator, you greet him. And I said, I'm not his nurse. He can get off the elevator by himself. And she said, and she had been taught that when any doctor comes into the nurse's station, you leap out of your chair so that he can sit down. I said, not if I'm in the middle of charting. It's not going to happen. And I think I taught her some things that she kind of believed in or thought ought to happen. But if she thought I was going to wait at the elevator with a cup of hot coffee for the surgeon, And I think that was a change, though, that there are still hospitals that are very regimented. And, you just kind of have to say, no, I'm taking care of patients now. I'll get with you in a minute. That's my job.
It reminds me of another question, and I think we've talked about this before, Anne, but my wife Sheila, so her brother-in-law, Jeff, is a career nurse, has worked at the VA hospital in Birmingham for many years. Mm-hmm. And so Sheila's middle nephew, her younger sister Tolly, her nephew Austin has just finished nursing school, and he just actually has a position in Auburn, mm-hmm. That he's going into. But what has been the impact of more and more men going into nursing?
Oh, it's wonderful. It's just wonderful. Many of them use it as a stepping stone to something else. In the early days, I had 4 men in a class. We fought over them because, of course, it made a much more balanced post-discussion in conference after clinical if you have a male point of view instead of just all us girls. But all of them, I think with the exception of one, used that as a jumping off point to go into anesthesia and have their own practices in South Florida. And one who is still very active in the Alumni Association with me at the College of Nursing. In the VA, I saw a very unhappy thing happening, and that was that they had people who already had some points from being a corpsman in the service. When they got their baccalaureate in nursing, they ran them up the chain of command, and they put them in supervisory positions when they kind of weren't ready for it. Oh boy, or the other bad thing that they did, not just VA but other places, is use them for manual labor. We've got to lift this heavy patient, call so-and-so. Well, that's not fair. They're not there for manual labor. They're a baccalaureate nurse.
Mm-hmm.
Question. So after doing all oral histories and everything, how do you feel that has changed or shaped your life, and continues to do?
I think it's kept my brain cells going.
Okay.
I'm never. I come home and I'm looking up things about seeing if the Google map can really find that island in the Pacific, or. And if you ask probing question, I can't ask the scientific questions about what caliber gun was on the bow of the ship. They'd know I was faking right off the bat. But I can ask the questions from the perspective of the next reader, the person who's going to be interested in that interview, or the family. And I can ask the question about, I don't know, what does that look like, or what does that do? For the military, one of the prime questions is they rattle off a bunch of initials or jargon, and you just stop them and say, now what, is that what this is? And a lot of them I know, of course, by now. But the other thing is, I'm not trying to show off how smart they are. I want to understand, and I often ask, what was your job? Now, I know that's not the military way to ask it, but the reader will understand what I say.
Yeah. As opposed to them saying, my MOS was...
Bingo.
And you're like, what does that mean? Right.
I had no idea you had an MOS. It's terrible. Did you treat it?
Right. Yeah.
Well, every once in a while there will be somebody who slips in an abbreviation. And so then I think it's the transcriber's job to say, I have this whole list of abbreviations and I can fill that in brackets.
Yeah.
And make it understandable. But somebody who's just throwing that one after another, you have to kind of slow them down and say, wait a minute, I'm just me, talk plain.
Yeah. One of the, and just one or two more questions, if you don't mind, and then we will make this a series of future interviews. But thinking back in your experience in high school history, which is not unusual for any one of us to forget everything we were taught in high school history courses. And when I talk to high school, even when I talk to teachers in training, or people earning advanced education degrees at UF who have been teachers for many years, and I ask them, I say, how would you describe the environment of high school history courses today? Give me some descriptive terms. And the terms that they throw out, boring, dull, and then we kind of try to figure out, well, how could we make history not boring, dull, or all these things? Yeah. But what are some ways that oral history can kind of spice up maybe that textbook or that high school history class, so that the kids, you wouldn't have to walk into a social studies course and see half the kids with their heads on the desk and struggling to stay awake. But what can oral history do?
I think role playing is a good one. Bob Gachet used to teach in the high school. In fact, I gave him the Japanese rifle that my uncle had. I didn't know what to do with it in the back of my closet. And I said, do you ever use visual aids when you're teaching in the high school? He said, oh, yeah. And so he intended to do that, to use the rifle. And, well, that gets everybody's attention, primarily boys, but, you know, I learned how to. But I think if students, and I have heard that there are classes where they use oral history and they say, this is what your mission is. You're trying to ask somebody about their childhood. Interview your father or your mother. That would be valuable stuff later on when they go into ancestry and they think, I don't remember her saying where she was born. You know, they don't think to ask that. You don't. If they have a grandparent, all the better. But barring that, you can say, okay, we're going to take turns. Now you ask me questions, or I'll ask you questions. And everybody learns a lot, and it's not scary. But it was the Newberry School, I think, some school in Newberry that had a whole series, and they had combined, I think, the English class, maybe with the writing class or something like that. And they would kind of publish it and make it into a little booklet for everybody, so that they could have it to take home, but have this series of interviews, of oral histories. They would interview an uncle or something that was there. What do you know about him? And give some suggestions about questions they could ask. I think it's good practice, you know, just in conversation.
Well, I think it's so empowering, too, to think that, I mean, because all our lives we grow up, in general, reading about other people's stories.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons history is so boring is you look at a textbook and it's about, you know, people like Roosevelt, Truman, Reagan, and Hamilton, and Madison, and Jefferson. And there's one thing all those men have in common, right? They're not part of your or my family.
Yeah.
And so the idea that you would ask me as a high school student, oh, interview your uncle, your aunt, or I mean, it's really so empowering.
Well, and they learn something they never expected to learn. As I said, everybody's got a story, and I just think that families don't know each other. The reason I've used the example with the veterans, I said they sit around the Thanksgiving table, and there's lots of conversation, and some young member of the family said, "Well, what did you do in the war?" And they start to answer and start to say, but then the mashed potatoes come in and it's gone, and there's confusion and more, and that's all he talked about. I mean, that's everything that he had to say because everything else was going on. At least that's how it was in my house. It was just commotion, everybody talking at once, and you didn't hear the rest of anything. But Tony, you know, whose uncle would take him into the back room and they would talk stuff, manly things, you know. If I punched you here, what would you do to defend yourself? That's exciting. Didn't want to be in there with all the ladies talking anyway.
Well, and I think we'll wrap up for now, but are there anything else that you want to share before we kind of...
Well, I probably have been a thorn in people's side around here about Deborah helping me with stuff and you, and I've just fallen in love with oral history, and I've done more in your marketing department than you'll ever know.
Thank you.
Because I drank the Kool-Aid here.
Very cool. I'm glad you did. I'm just so proud of your colleague. And we'll just kind of wrap up for now. But again, thank you so much for coming in.
You're welcome.
And sharing part of your story with us.
Okay. Thank you very much.